All right, everyone. Welcome to week 4. Up to this point in the course, we've been talking about ethics primarily at the individual level. In other words, we've been asking questions like, what should I do as a healthcare professional? What ethical principles guide my decisions? But healthcare is not practiced in isolation. None of us work alone. Even in the laboratory, where we sometimes joke that we prefer microscopes to people, our work still sits inside a much larger healthcare system. And that system has structure. Hospitals, laboratories, clinics, and healthcare organizations develop formal mechanisms to support ethical decision making. One of the most important of those mechanisms is the Healthcare Ethics Committee. Ethics committees help healthcare professionals, patients, and families navigate situations where the right decision isn't obvious, situations where values collide, situations where there may be disagreement among clinicians, patients, or family members. In addition to committees, healthcare organizations also build policies, oversight structures, and accountability systems designed to maintain ethical standards. So this week we're going to zoom out a little. Instead of looking only at individual ethical responsibility, we're going to explore organizational ethics, how institutions themselves help guide ethical healthcare practice. And even though laboratory professionals often work behind the scenes, these systems absolutely affect us. Our test results influence diagnoses, treatment decisions, and sometimes end-of-life care. So understanding how ethical decisions are supported at the organizational level is part of being a responsible healthcare professional. Before we move forward, let's briefly orient ourselves in the course so far. In weeks 1 through 3, we focused on the foundations of healthcare ethics. We started with the basics, what ethics actually means in healthcare and why ethical reasoning matters in professional practice. We talked about the difference between law, ethics, and morals, and why something can be legally acceptable but still ethically questionable. Then we explored the core ethical principles that guide healthcare decision-making: autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice. Those 4 principles show up again and again in clinical situations, and they form the backbone of ethical reasoning in healthcare. After that, we moved into ethical dilemmas in practice. Those situations where there isn't a clean answer and professionals have to balance competing responsibilities. And in week 3, we examined end-of-life decision-making, which is one of the areas where ethical conflicts appear most frequently in healthcare. We discussed advanced directives, treatment refusal, surrogate decision-making, and the ethical complexities that arise when patients, families, and clinicians may not all agree. Now, in week 4, we shift perspective. Instead of focusing only on individual ethical decision-making, we start looking at organizational ethics, how healthcare institutions create systems that help guide ethical practice. Because in real healthcare environments, ethical decisions rarely happen in isolation. They occur within structures, policies, and professional systems that shape how decisions are made. One of the biggest misconceptions about healthcare ethics is the idea that ethical decisions are made by a single heroic professional standing alone and deciding what is right. In reality, healthcare is much more collaborative and much more structured than that. Most decisions occur within systems that include policies, regulations, professional standards, and institutional oversight. For example, when a difficult clinical decision arises, providers may rely on hospital policy, professional guidelines, or consultation from an ethics committee. These systems exist because modern healthcare is incredibly complex, and no single professional can realistically navigate every ethical challenge alone. Think about the laboratory environment for a moment. Even something as straightforward as releasing a test result is guided by layers of institutional structure, laboratory protocols, quality assurance standards, regulatory requirements, and professional codes of conduct. Those structures exist to protect patients, support professionals, and promote consistent ethical practice. When ethical conflicts arise, especially in complicated situations involving patient rights, treatment decisions, or disagreements among stakeholders, Ethics committees provide a structured way to evaluate those situations thoughtfully. They help ensure that ethical decisions are not made impulsively or based solely on individual opinion. Instead, decisions are examined through a framework that considers clinical facts, ethical principles, legal considerations, and patient perspectives. In other words, organizational ethics provides the guardrails that help healthcare professionals navigate difficult situations responsibly. This week, we're going to focus on three major questions that shape how ethical decision making works in healthcare organizations. The first question is, how do healthcare organizations support ethical decision making? Healthcare institutions don't simply hope that ethical decisions happen. They actively create structures, policies, committees, compliance programs, and professional guidelines designed to support responsible decision making. The second question is, who helps resolve ethical conflicts? When complex situations arise, especially those involving disagreement among healthcare providers, patients, or families, institutions often turn to ethics committees for guidance. These committees bring together professionals from multiple disciplines to analyze the situation and facilitate discussion. And the third question is one that comes up frequently in real healthcare environments. What happens when professionals disagree about the right decision? Disagreement is actually very common in healthcare ethics. Clinicians may weigh risks differently. Families may interpret patient wishes differently. Even professionals with the same ethical training may reach different conclusions. Ethics committees exist partly because of this reality. Their role is not to impose a decision, but to facilitate structured reasoning, clarify ethical principles, and help stakeholders reach a thoughtful and ethically defensible outcome. So as we move through this lecture, keep those three questions in mind. They will help frame how healthcare organizations manage ethical complexity and how professionals, including laboratory professionals, fit into that process. Before we jump into the details, let's take a moment to frame what we're actually trying to understand this week. Up to this point in the course, most of our conversations about ethics have focused on individual decision making, what a healthcare professional should do when faced with an ethical dilemma. But healthcare does not operate solely at the level of individual judgment. Instead, it operates within complex organizational systems. So this week, we're going to examine four major ideas. First, we'll look at healthcare ethics committees, what they are, how they are structured, and why hospitals and healthcare systems rely on them. Second, we'll talk about ethical consultation, which is the process healthcare teams use when they encounter a particularly difficult ethical situation and need guidance from an ethics committee. Third, we'll examine organizational accountability. The idea that healthcare institutions themselves have ethical responsibilities, not just individual professionals. And finally, we'll discuss institutional responsibility for ethical practice, including how organizations establish policies, compliance programs, and professional standards designed to maintain ethical care environments. In other words, this week we move from asking, what should I do, to asking, how do healthcare systems support professionals in making ethical decisions? And as laboratory professionals, that matters to us more than we might initially think, because even though we often work behind the scenes, our work is still part of that larger ethical system. Now we begin the first major topic for this week, healthcare ethics committees. If you've never encountered one before, the concept may sound a little abstract, but ethics committees are actually a very practical part of modern healthcare systems. These committees exist because healthcare decisions can become extremely complex, especially when they involve serious illness, uncertainty, or disagreement among stakeholders. Think about the kinds of situations that might arise in a hospital. A patient may be unable to communicate their wishes. Family members may disagree about treatment. A physician may believe continuing treatment is harmful, while a family member insists it should continue. These situations are not uncommon, and they often include conflicting ethical values. Instead of leaving these decisions entirely to one individual or one discipline, Healthcare organizations establish ethics committees that can help guide the decision-making process. These committees bring together professionals from multiple areas of healthcare to help analyze difficult ethical questions and facilitate discussion among those involved. The goal isn't to replace the clinical team. The goal is to provide structured ethical reasoning when situations become particularly challenging. So let's define the concept more clearly. A healthcare ethics committee is essentially an advisory group that helps healthcare providers, patients, and families navigate complicated ethical situations that arise in patient care. Notice the word advisory. Ethics committees generally do not function as decision-making authorities in the same way that clinical teams or administrators might. Instead, they help clarify ethical issues, review relevant principles, and facilitate discussion among stakeholders. Their purpose is to bring thoughtful analysis to situations where the right answer isn't immediately obvious. For example, a healthcare team might request an ethics consultation when there is uncertainty about continuing life-sustaining treatment, when a patient refuses recommended care, or when family members strongly disagree about medical decisions. In those situations, the ethics committee helps examine the tissue from multiple perspectives, so clinical, ethical, legal, and sometimes cultural or religious. And this is important because healthcare decisions rarely occur in a vacuum. They involve patients, families, clinicians, institutions, and sometimes even broader social considerations. Ethics committees provide a space where those factors can be evaluated carefully rather than reacted to impulsively. In short, they help transform emotionally charged situations into structured ethical discussions. Now let's talk about why ethics committees exist in the first place. Healthcare environments frequently involve situations where the correct course of action is not immediately clear. And that uncertainty usually comes from three major sources. First, there may be conflicting values. A patient might prioritize quality of life, while a family member prioritizes extending life as long as possible. A physician may focus on medical outcomes, while a patient may focus on personal beliefs or cultural values. Second, healthcare often involves uncertain outcomes. Even with modern medicine, providers cannot always predict exactly how a patient will respond to treatment. That uncertainty can make ethical decisions much more difficult. Third, healthcare professionals often face difficult decisions that carry significant consequences for patients and families. These decisions may involve continuing or withdrawing treatment, allocating limited resources, or balancing patient autonomy with medical recommendations. Ethics committees exist because navigating those situations requires more than just quick judgment. They provide structured guidance that helps professionals evaluate the facts, identify the ethical principles involved, and explore possible courses of action in a thoughtful and responsible way. And while many people think of ethics committees as dealing primarily with physicians and bedside decisions, the outcomes of those discussions often rely heavily on accurate laboratory data, which means the work we do in the laboratory is still part of that ethical decision-making ecosystem. To understand why ethics committees exist today, it helps to look briefly at how they developed historically. Healthcare ethics committees began appearing more widely in hospitals during the 1970s and 1980s. This was a time when medicine was undergoing some major changes. Medical technology was advancing rapidly. Hospitals suddenly had new tools that could sustain life in ways that had never been possible before, things like long-term mechanical ventilation, advanced resuscitation methods, dialysis, and increasingly sophisticated intensive care units. While these technologies saved many lives, they also created a new ethical question that physicians and families hadn't really faced before. For example, if technology can keep someone alive indefinitely, should it always be used? What happens when a patient cannot communicate their wishes? Who decides whether treatment should continue? These questions became particularly visible in high-profile legal cases in the United States involving life support and patient rights. As a result, hospitals began recognizing that clinicians needed structured support for ethical decision-making. That recognition led to the creation of hospital ethics committees, which provided a formal way to discuss difficult situations and evaluate them using ethical principles rather than relying on individual judgment alone. Today, ethics committees are a standard component of many healthcare institutions. Now let's look at some of the types of ethical questions that ethics committees may be asked to help evaluate. One common question involves life-sustaining treatment. For example, should life support be withdrawn if a patient has little chance of recovery? These situations can be emotionally difficult and ethically complex because they involve balancing beneficence, non-malfeasance, and respect for patient autonomy. Another common question arises when patients cannot make decisions for themselves. If a patient is unconscious or lacks decision-making capacity, someone else must make medical decisions on their behalf. Determining who should serve as that decision maker and how their decisions should reflect the patient's wishes can sometimes become complicated. Ethics committees may also become involved when family members disagree about treatment decisions. One relative may believe aggressive treatment should continue, while another believes the patient would not want prolonged intervention. And finally, healthcare ethics discussions often involve questions about allocating limited medical resources. When resources such as ICU beds, organ transplants, or specialized treatments are limited, healthcare systems must determine how those resources should be distributed fairly. These kinds of questions illustrate why ethical reasoning is so important in healthcare. They rarely have simple answers. Now that we've talked about what ethics committees do, it's just as important to understand what they do not do. First, ethics committees do not replace clinical judgment. Physicians, nurses, and other healthcare professionals remain responsible for making medical decisions about diagnosis and treatment. Second, ethics committees do not make medical diagnoses. Their role is not clinical. Instead, their role is to help analyze the ethical dimensions of a situation. Third, ethics committees do not override patient rights. Patients still maintain the right to make decisions about their care when they have decision-making capacity, and advance directives must be respected when they exist. Instead of controlling decisions, ethics committees serve as a facilitating body. They help healthcare teams think through complicated situations more carefully by identifying the relevant ethical principles, reviewing the clinical facts, and encouraging open discussion among the parties involved. You can think of them as guides for ethical reasoning, not authorities who impose decisions. Their value comes from helping healthcare teams move from emotionally charged conflict towards thoughtful ethical analysis. Now that we understand the purpose of ethics committees, the next question becomes who actually serves on these committees? Ethics committees are intentionally designed to be multidisciplinary. That means they include professionals from different backgrounds within healthcare. This structure is important because ethical questions often involve more than just clinical information. They may involve legal considerations, patient perspectives, cultural values, and institutional policy. A typical ethics committee might include physicians, nurses, hospital administrators, social workers, legal advisors, and sometimes chaplains or community representatives. Each of these members brings a different perspective to the discussion. For example, physicians contribute clinical expertise, nurses often provide insight into day-to-day patient care, social workers may understand family dynamics, and legal advisors help clarify regulatory considerations. This diversity of perspectives helps ensure that ethical decisions are evaluated from multiple viewpoints rather than a single professional lens. In the next section, we'll look more closely at how these committees are structured and how they function in real healthcare environments. Okay. Now that we understand what ethics committees are and why they exist, the next question becomes, who actually sits on these committees? Ethics committees are intentionally built to include professionals from multiple areas of healthcare and the community. The goal is to bring together people with different kinds of expertise and perspectives. Typically, you'll see physicians and nurses on the committee because they are directly involved in patient care and can explain the clinical realities of a case. You'll often see social workers who provide insight into family dynamics, patient support systems, and the social circumstances that may affect decision making. Hospital administrators are often involved because ethical decisions sometimes intersect with institutional policies, regulatory requirements, or resource allocation. Many committees also include legal advisors who help clarify healthcare law and ensure decisions align with legal obligations. You may also see chaplains or spiritual care providers who contribute perspective on cultural, moral, and religious concerns that patients or families may bring into medical decision making. And importantly, many committees include community members, individuals who are not healthcare professionals but who represent the broader patient population. This mix of perspectives helps ensure ethical decisions aren't made only through a single professional lens. Because in real healthcare situations, ethical questions rarely involve just medicine. They involve people, values, culture, and society as well. So why is this multidisciplinary structure so important? Simply put, ethical decisions become stronger when multiple perspectives are considered. Healthcare professionals often approach problems through the lens of their own training and responsibilities. Physicians may focus on clinical outcomes. Nurses may focus on patient comfort and daily care needs. Administrators may consider policy implications or resource management. Each perspective is valuable, but none of them alone tells the whole story. When an ethics committee reviews a situation, members collectively examine several dimensions of the issue. They consider the clinical realities of the patient's condition, what treatments are available, and what outcomes are realistically expected. They evaluate legal obligations such as patient rights, informed consent laws, and regulatory guidelines that healthcare organizations must follow. They examine social implications, including family dynamics, communication challenges, and the potential effects of decisions on caregivers. And they also consider cultural and religious values, which often shape how patients and families interpret illness, treatment decisions, and end-of-life care. In other words, ethics committees are designed to prevent decisions from becoming too narrow or one-dimensional. They encourage healthcare teams to step back and look at the situation from a broader perspective. And that broader view is often what leads to more thoughtful and ethically balanced outcomes. One of the most interesting features of healthcare ethics committees is the inclusion of community members. At first glance, it might seem unusual to include individuals who are not healthcare professionals in discussions about complex medical decisions. But their presence actually varies. Healthcare institutions can sometimes develop a very internal perspective. Professionals become accustomed to certain practices, certain language, and certain ways of thinking about medical problems. Community members help bring a broader societal perspective into the conversation. They represent the viewpoint of the patients and families who ultimately experience healthcare decisions. Their presence helps ensure that discussions do not become overly technical or disconnected from the values and concerns of the community the hospital serves. Community members may also help raise questions that healthcare professionals might not immediately think about. Questions related to trust, communication, cultural sensitivity, or patient understanding. In that way, they help prevent ethical decision-making from becoming purely institutional. Instead, they help ensure that decisions reflect societal values and patient-centered perspectives. And in healthcare ethics, maintaining that connection to the broader public is extremely important. Now that we've talked about who sits on ethics committees, let's look at what these committees actually do in practice. Most ethics committees focus on three major responsibilities. The first is case consultation. This is probably the function people think of most often. When a complex ethical issue arises in patient care, for example, a dispute about treatment decisions or uncertainty about respecting a patient's wishes, the healthcare team may request an ethics consultation. The committee reviews the situation, helps clarify the ethical issues involved, and facilitates discussion among the people involved in the case. The second major responsibility is policy development. Hospitals rely on ethics committees to help create or review policies related to ethical issues in healthcare. These might include policies on end-of-life care, informed consent, advance directives, or patient decision-making capacity. By establishing clear policies, healthcare organizations can help guide professionals before ethical conflicts arise. The third responsibility is education. Ethics committees often help provide education for healthcare staff about ethical principles, patient rights, and decision-making framework. This helps ensure that ethical reasoning becomes part of everyday professional practice rather than something that only appears during major conflicts. Taken together, these responsibilities allow ethics committees to support both immediate ethical challenges and long-term institutional integrity. They help healthcare organizations move from simply reacting to ethical problems to actively promoting ethical practice throughout the system. Up to this point, we've talked about ethics committees as structures within healthcare organizations, who sits on them and what responsibilities they have. Now we're going to focus on how those committees are actually used in real clinical situations, and that brings us to the idea of ethics consultations. An ethics consultation occurs when a healthcare team encounters a situation where the ethical path forward is not entirely clear. In other words, the clinical facts may be known, but deciding what should be done becomes complicated, and that happens more often than people might think. Modern healthcare involves complex decisions about treatment options, patient autonomy, quality of life, and resource allocation. Even when everyone involved is acting in good faith, those decisions can still lead to disagreement or uncertainty. That's when the healthcare team may request an ethics consultation. Instead of making a rushed decision or allowing conflict to escalate, the team brings the situation to the ethics committee for structured evaluation. The goal of consultation is not to take decision-making power away from the care team, but rather to help clarify the ethical issues involved and support a thoughtful, well-reasoned path forward. In many ways, ethics consultation functions like diagnostic reasoning, except instead of analyzing laboratory values or pathology slides, the committee is analyzing ethical principles, patient rights, and competing responsibilities. So what exactly do we mean by ethical consultation? At its core, ethical consultation occurs when healthcare professionals seek guidance about a situation that involves difficult ethical considerations in patient care. These situations usually arise when there are competing priorities or when it isn't immediately clear how ethical principles should be applied. For example, a patient may refuse a treatment that clinicians believe is medically necessary. A family may request continued life-sustaining treatment even when physicians believe the treatment is unlikely to benefit the patient. Or different members of the healthcare team may disagree about the most appropriate course of action. In those moments, ethical consultation helps create a structured environment for evaluating the issue. Rather than relying on personal opinions or emotional reactions, the consultation process encourages the team to examine the situation through ethical frameworks, considering principles like autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice. This process also helps ensure that communication remains open and respectful among everyone involved. And although laboratory rarely hosting ethics consultations directly, our work still plays an important role in these cases. Accurate laboratory data often informs the clinical decisions being debated, whether that involves organ failure markers, infectious disease testing, or pathology results that influence treatment options. So even if we're not in the room during the consultation, the information produced in the laboratory often shapes the ethical discussion. Let's look at some examples of situations where an ethics consultation might be requested. One of the most common involves end-of-life decision-making. These situations can arise when patients are critically ill and decisions must be made about continuing or withdrawing life-sustaining treatments, such as mechanical ventilation, dialysis, or resuscitation efforts. Families and clinicians may struggle with determining what course of action best reflects the patient's wishes and medical reality. Another situation involves treatment refusal. Patients have the legal and ethical right to refuse treatment, even if that treatment might improve their health or save their life. However, conflicts can arise when healthcare providers worry that refusing treatment could cause serious harm. Consultations may also occur when there is conflict between patient wishes and medical recommendations. For example, a patient may request an intervention that physicians believe would provide little benefit or could potentially cause harm. And then there are situations involving disagreements between family members. When patients cannot make decisions for themselves, family members or designated surrogates may step in to help guide care. But families don't always agree with one another, and disagreements can become emotionally intense. In these types of scenarios, ethics consultation helps shift the conversation from conflict to careful ethical reasoning. Now let's walk through what the consultation process usually looks like. The first step typically involves gathering relevant medical information. Before any ethical discussion can occur, the committee needs a clear understanding of the patient's medical condition, prognosis, treatment options, and clinical context. This step is similar to how we approach diagnostic reasoning in laboratory medicine. You can't interpret data if you don't understand the clinical picture. The second step is identifying the ethical principles involved. Is this situation primarily about respecting patient autonomy? Are there concerns about potential harm or benefit? Is fairness or resource allocation part of the issue? Once these principles are identified, the committee may review institutional policies. Healthcare organizations often have policies regarding advance directives, end-of-life care, informed consent, and decision-making capacity. These policies help ensure that ethical decisions remain consistent with institutional standards and legal obligations. Finally, the committee works to facilitate discussion among stakeholders. This includes the healthcare team, the patient when possible, and family members or surrogate decision makers. The goal isn't to impose a decision, but to create a structured conversation where everyone can understand the ethical considerations involved and move towards a thoughtful resolution. In many ways, ethical consultation is about bringing clarity and structure to situations that might otherwise feel chaotic or emotionally overwhelming. When ethics consultations occur, the discussion almost always centers around the four core ethical principles we introduced earlier in the course: autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice. These principles act like a framework or lens that helps healthcare professionals evaluate complicated situations. Let's briefly revisit what each one contributes to ethical reasoning. Autonomy focuses on the patient's right to make decisions about their own care. Even when clinicians believe a different course of action would be medically beneficial, patients still retain the right to accept or refuse treatment if they have decision-making capacity. Beneficence refers to the responsibility of healthcare professionals to act in ways that promote the patient's well-being. Clinicians must consider what interventions are most likely to benefit the patient medically. Non-malfeasance is closely related, but slightly different. It emphasizes the obligation to avoid causing harm. Healthcare providers must consider whether a treatment might produce unnecessary suffering or negative outcomes. Finally, justice focuses on fairness. This includes fair distribution of healthcare resources, equitable treatment of patients, and ensuring that decisions are not influenced by bias or discrimination. In an ethics consultation, these principles are rarely considered in isolation. Instead, the challenge is often balancing them. For example, a patient's autonomous choice might conflict with what clinicians believe would be most beneficial medically. Ethical reasoning helps healthcare teams carefully weigh those tensions. One of the most important lessons learned from decades of ethics consultation in healthcare is that many conflicts arise not from fundamental ethical disagreement, but from miscommunication. Healthcare environments are complex, fast-paced, and emotionally charged. Patients and families may feel overwhelmed, frightened, or uncertain. At the same time, healthcare professionals may be focused on clinical information and treatment options. If communication breaks down, misunderstandings can develop quickly. For example, a physician may explain a prognosis using medical terminology that a family interprets differently than intended. Or family members may believe that continuing aggressive treatment is required when the healthcare team is trying to discuss comfort-focused care. In these situations, an ethics committee often plays an important role in facilitating dialogue. They help ensure that communication remains clear, respectful, and focused on the patient's values and goals. This dialogue frequently includes multiple groups of stakeholders: healthcare providers, patients when possible, and family members or surrogate decision makers. The goal is to make sure that everyone involved understands the medical situation, the ethical considerations, and the possible options moving forward. Even though laboratory professionals are typically not involved in these conversations directly, our work still contributes to them. Clear, accurate laboratory results and documentation help ensure that clinical decisions are based on reliable information, which ultimately supports better communication throughout the healthcare team. It's important to understand that the purpose of an ethics consultation is not to impose a decision. Ethics committees do not function like courts issuing final rulings. Instead, their role is to help guide the healthcare team and involved stakeholders towards a thoughtful, ethically supported outcome. In other words, they help facilitate the decision-making process rather than dictate the decision itself. The committee examines the medical facts, considers ethical principles, reviews relevant policies, and helps clarify the patient's wishes when possible. Through this process, they assist the healthcare team, patients, and families in identifying a course of action that aligns with ethical standards, medical realities, and the patient's values. This collaborative approach is important because healthcare decisions often involve deeply personal considerations. Respecting the dignity of the patient and maintaining trust between the healthcare team and family members is critical. Think of ethics consultation as a structured, problem-solving process. Instead of reacting emotionally or rushing towards a conclusion, the consultation encourages careful reflection and respectful discussion. And again, even though laboratory professionals may not participate directly in these consultations, the data generated in the laboratory often informs the clinical decisions being discussed, reinforcing how interconnected all areas of healthcare really are. So far in this lecture, we focused primarily on how ethics committees help address individual patient situations. But ethical responsibility in healthcare extends beyond individual decisions. It also involves organizational accountability. Healthcare organizations themselves have ethical obligations. Hospitals, clinics, laboratories, and other healthcare institutions must create environments that promote ethical behavior, protect patient rights, and support responsible decision-making by healthcare professionals. This includes establishing clear policies related to patient consent, confidentiality, end-of-life care, and professional conduct. Organizations must also ensure that healthcare professionals receive appropriate education and training related to ethical standards and patient rights. Accountability also involves maintaining systems that encourage transparency and allow concerns about ethical issues to be raised and addressed. For example, many institutions provide mechanisms for reporting ethical concerns, safety issues, or professional misconduct without fear of retaliation. In the laboratory environment, organizational accountability may include policies related to quality assurance, documentation accuracy, specimen handling, and result reporting. All of these practices contribute to maintaining trust in the healthcare system. Ultimately, ethical healthcare requires both individual professional responsibility and strong institutional support. Ethics committees represent one important piece of that broader system. Up to this point, we've talked about ethics primarily at the individual decision-making level, how clinicians, families, and patients navigate difficult decisions. But ethical healthcare doesn't exist in a vacuum. It depends heavily on the systems and structures created by healthcare organizations themselves. That's where organizational accountability comes in. Organizational accountability refers to the responsibility healthcare institutions have to create systems that support ethical practice. In other words, ethical behavior isn't something we just hope individuals will do on their own. It needs to be built into the policies, procedures, and culture of the institution. Hospitals, laboratories, clinics, and healthcare systems must establish environments where ethical standards are clearly defined and consistently reinforced. This includes developing policies that protect both patients and healthcare professionals. For patients, these policies help safeguard rights such as confidentiality, informed consent, and access to safe and effective care. For healthcare workers, policies help establish expectations regarding professional conduct, workplace safety, reporting concerns, and accountability. Think about this from a laboratory perspective. Ethical laboratory practice depends on systems that ensure accurate testing, proper specimen handling, quality control, and reliable reporting. Those systems don't happen by accident. They are the result of organizational structures designed to support ethical and responsible care. So while individuals carry ethical responsibilities, organizations must create the framework that makes ethical practice possible. Expanding on that idea, healthcare institutions have several core responsibilities when it comes to maintaining ethical practice. First and foremost is the obligation to ensure quality patient care. Quality care isn't just about advanced technology or specialized expertise. It also means providing care that is safe, consistent, evidence-based, and respectful of patient rights. Ethical conduct is another major responsibility. Healthcare organizations must create cultures where professionalism, honesty, and respect for patients are the norm. This often involves training programs, professional guidelines, and leadership that models ethical behavior. Then we have regulatory compliance. Healthcare operates within a complex network of laws and regulations designed to protect patient safety and maintain standards of care. Organizations must ensure they comply with these requirements, not just to avoid penalties, but to uphold the integrity of the healthcare system. And finally, institutions must promote professional accountability. Healthcare professionals are trusted with enormous responsibility. Organizations must provide systems that encourage responsible practice, support ethical decision-making, and address problems when they occur. In the laboratory environment, this may include oversight mechanisms such as quality assurance programs, laboratory accreditation standards, and ongoing competency assessments. These structures help ensure that the work being performed behind the scenes in the laboratory continues to support safe and ethical patient care. One of the most common ways healthcare organizations reinforce ethical expectations is through the development of codes of ethics. A code of ethics is essentially a formal statement outlining the principles and standards that guide professional behavior within an organization or profession. These codes provide a shared framework for decision making. They help employees understand what behaviors are expected, what responsibilities they hold, and how they should approach ethical challenges in their professional roles. In healthcare, codes of ethics often emphasize values such as patient dignity, confidentiality, professional integrity, and commitment to high standards of care. Professional organizations also develop their own ethical codes. For example, laboratory professionals often look to the ethical guidelines established by organizations such as the American Society for Clinical Laboratory Science, or also ASCLS, or similar professional bodies. These codes remind us that laboratory work is not just technical, it carries ethical responsibilities. Every specimen we process, every result we report, and every record we document has the potential to influence patient care decisions. Codes of ethics help ensure that those responsibilities are approached with professional integrity and respect for patient well-being. Another key component of organizational accountability is the implementation of corporate compliance programs. Compliance programs are systems designed to help healthcare organizations ensure they are operating in accordance with laws, regulations, accreditation standards, and patient safety requirements. Healthcare is one of the most heavily regulated industries, and for good reason. The stakes are extremely high. Decisions made with healthcare organizations directly affect patient lives. Compliance programs help organizations monitor their practices and identify potential issues before they become serious problems. These programs typically involve elements such as policy development, employee training, internal audits, and mechanisms for reporting concerns. From a laboratory perspective, compliance programs are particularly important. Laboratories must adhere to numerous regulatory standards related to test validation, quality control, specimen tracking, documentation, and reporting accuracy. For example, accreditation organizations and regulatory bodies require laboratories to maintain strict procedures that ensure testing reliability and patient safety. Compliance programs help ensure that these requirements are consistently followed. Ultimately, corporate compliance programs help maintain trust in the healthcare system by ensuring that institutions operate transparently, responsibly, and within established ethical and legal standards. When we talk about compliance programs in healthcare organizations, it's helpful to look at specific areas they typically monitor and oversee. One major focus area is billing practices. Healthcare billing is incredibly complex, and errors, whether intentional or accidental, can lead to serious legal and ethical problems. Compliance programs help ensure that services are billed accurately and that organizations are not submitting claims for procedures that were not performed or improperly documented. Another critical area is patient privacy, particularly under regulations like HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. HIPAA establishes strict guidelines for protecting patient health information. Compliance programs help ensure that patient records, laboratory results, and electronic health data are handled securely and only accessed by authorized individuals. Fraud prevention is another major responsibility. Healthcare fraud can include things like falsifying records, billing for unnecessary services, or manipulating test documentation. Compliance programs implement monitoring systems to detect irregularities and prevent unethical or illegal activity. Finally, compliance oversight often focuses on documentation accuracy. In healthcare, and especially in laboratory medicine, documentation is everything. Test results, specimen records, quality control logs, and patient identifiers must all be recorded accurately and consistently. Poor documentation can lead to diagnostic errors, billing issues, and regulatory violations. That's why compliance programs emphasize meticulous record keeping and accountability. Now we're going to shift into a concept that connects ethics, organizational responsibility, and legal accountability, and that is corporate negligence. Corporate negligence occurs when a healthcare organization itself fails to fulfill its responsibilities in a way that contributes to patient harm. Unlike individual malpractice, which focuses on the actions of a single healthcare professional, corporate negligence examines whether the organization failed to provide the systems necessary for safe care. For example, healthcare organizations have a responsibility to ensure they employ competent and properly trained staff. If an institution hires unqualified personnel or fails to verify credentials, that failure can place patients at risk. Organizations must also maintain safe environments. This includes ensuring that equipment functions properly, infection control procedures are followed, and facilities meet safety standards. Another key responsibility is adequate supervision. Healthcare professionals, especially those in training or early in their careers, must be appropriately supervised to ensure patient safety and professional development. From a laboratory standpoint, this might include oversight of testing procedures, validation of new methods, or supervision of students and trainees. If an organization fails in these responsibilities and patient harm results, it may be held legally accountable under the doctrine of corporate negligence. To better understand corporate negligence, it helps to look at some examples of organizational failures that can lead to ethical and legal consequences. One example is understaffing. When healthcare institutions operate with insufficient staffing levels, employees may become overworked and fatigued. In laboratory environments, this can increase the likelihood of errors in specimen handling, test performance, or result reporting. Fatigue and workload pressures are well-known contributors to mistakes in healthcare systems. Another example is ignoring safety risks. If an organization becomes aware of potential safety concerns, such as malfunctioning equipment, inadequate infection control procedures, or repeated quality control failures, it has an obligation to investigate and correct those problems promptly. Failing to address known risks can place both patients and healthcare workers in danger. A third example is failing to investigate misconduct. If reports of unethical behavior, regulatory violations, or unsafe practices are ignored or dismissed without proper investigation, the organization is effectively allowing those problems to continue. Healthcare institutions must take concerns seriously and ensure that appropriate oversight mechanisms are in place. These examples highlight why organizational accountability is so important. Ethical healthcare requires systems that identify problems early and respond effectively. The final concept on this slide introduces an important legal doctrine known as respondeat superior. This Latin phrase translates roughly to "let the master answer." In legal terms, respondeat superior means that employers, including healthcare organizations, may be held responsible for the actions of their employees when those actions occur within the scope of employment. In other words, if a healthcare worker makes a mistake while performing duties related to their job, the organization itself may share legal responsibility. This principle recognizes that employees act on behalf of their organization when providing healthcare services. For example, if a laboratory technologist reports an incorrect result due to a procedural failure that occurred during routine testing, the institution may be held liable because the error occurred while the employee was performing assigned job duties. This doctrine encourages organizations to ensure they hire qualified personnel, provide proper training, and maintain effective supervision. From a laboratory perspective, respondeat superior reinforces the importance of clear procedures, competency assessments, and quality assurance systems. These safeguards help protect both patients and healthcare institutions by reducing the likelihood of errors and ensuring that employees are supported in performing their responsibilities correctly. When we talk about ethics in healthcare, we often focus on the decisions made by individual professionals. But in reality, organizational culture plays a major role in shaping these decisions. Organizational culture refers to the shared values, expectations, and behaviors that influence how people within an organization interact and make decisions. In ethical healthcare organizations, leadership promotes transparency. Transparency means that information is shared openly, mistakes are acknowledged, and decisions are explained clearly rather than hidden. Another key element is open communication. Healthcare is a complex team environment. Physicians, nurses, laboratory professionals, pharmacists, administrators, and many others must work together. When communication is open and respectful, concerns can be raised early and problems can be addressed before they escalate. The third component highlighted on this slide is accountability. Accountability means that individuals and organizations take responsibility for their actions. When something goes wrong, the focus should be on understanding what happened and improving systems to prevent it from happening again. In laboratory medicine, this might involve reviewing quality control data, investigating specimen handling errors, or identifying breakdowns in communication between the lab and clinical teams. Strong organizational culture supports ethical decision-making by creating an environment where people feel safe to speak up and work collaboratively to protect patient care. Unfortunately, not all healthcare organizations develop healthy, ethical cultures. When organizational culture fails, it can create environments where unethical practices or unsafe behaviors are more likely to occur. One warning sign is fear of reporting mistakes. Healthcare professionals must be able to report errors or near misses without fear of punishment. If employees believe they will be blamed, embarrassed, or disciplined for speaking up, mistakes may go unreported, which prevents organizations from learning and improving. Another serious concern is retaliation against whistleblowers. Whistleblowers are individuals who report unethical or illegal behavior within an organization. In ethical organizations, these individuals are protected and their concerns are investigated carefully. In unhealthy cultures, however, whistleblowers may face retaliation, which discourages others from reporting problems. The final issue listed on this slide is prioritizing profit over patient care. Healthcare organizations must operate financially, but ethical care requires that patient safety and well-being remain the primary priority. When financial incentives begin to influence clinical decisions in ways that compromise patient care, serious ethical problems can arise. For laboratory professionals, this might involve pressure to rush testing, reduce quality checks, or process samples in ways that compromise accuracy, all of which would be unacceptable in ethical practice. This slide marks the transition into the next section of the chapter, which focuses specifically on ethical culture within healthcare organizations. So far in this lecture, we've discussed ethical principles, legal accountability, corporate responsibility, and the role of compliance programs. Now we are going to shift our attention to something equally important: how organizations intentionally create environments that support ethical behavior. Ethical culture does not happen by accident. Healthcare organizations must actively build systems that encourage ethical awareness, provide guidance when difficult situations arise, and support employees in making responsible decisions. This includes leadership commitment, clear policies, ethics education, and mechanisms for reporting concerns. In many ways, ethical culture functions as the foundation that supports all other ethical practices in healthcare. Without it, even well-written policies or compliance programs may fail. As we move into this section, we will examine how healthcare organizations can actively promote ethical behavior among healthcare professionals and create systems that reinforce patient safety, accountability, and professional integrity. Building an ethical culture within healthcare organizations requires ongoing effort and commitment from leadership and staff at every level. One important component is ethical awareness. Healthcare professionals must be able to recognize ethical issues when they arise. Education and training help employees understand ethical principles and learn how to apply them in real situations. Another key element is collaboration. Healthcare is fundamentally a team effort. Ethical decision-making often benefits from multiple perspectives. When healthcare professionals collaborate, sharing expertise, asking questions, and discussing concerns, they are more likely to reach decisions that prioritize patient welfare. Collaboration is particularly important in complex healthcare environments where decisions involve many different specialties and responsibilities. The third component is patient-centered care. Ethical healthcare culture always keeps the patient at the center of decision-making. Policies, procedures, and clinical practices should ultimately support patient well-being, dignity, and safety. For laboratory professionals, patient-centered care may not always involve direct interaction with patients, but the impact of laboratory testing on diagnosis and treatment decisions is significant. Every specimen processed, every result verified, and every report issued contributes to the care of a real patient. An ethical culture reminds healthcare professionals that their work is not just technical. It is part of a broader system dedicated to improving and protecting patient health. When we talk about ethical healthcare environments, leadership plays a much bigger role than many people realize. Ethical cultures rarely emerge spontaneously. They are intentionally built and reinforced by leadership. Hospital and healthcare leadership are responsible for setting clear, ethical expectations. That means organizations must communicate what ethical behavior looks like in practice. Codes of conduct, professional standards, and institutional policies help define those expectations, but leadership must also demonstrate them through their own actions. In other words, ethical culture is not just what leadership says. It is what leadership models. Another key responsibility is supporting staff. Healthcare professionals often face complex ethical situations, especially when patient care decisions involve uncertainty, competing priorities, or emotional stress. Staff members need to feel that their supervisors and administrators will support them when they raise concerns or seek guidance. In laboratory medicine, this might involve supporting technologists who question unusual test results, raise concerns about specimen integrity, or identify potential quality control issues. Finally, leadership must address ethical violations promptly and fairly. Ignoring unethical behavior sends a message that those standards do not really matter. Effective leaders investigate concerns, correct problems, and ensure accountability while also focusing on improving systems that prevent future issues. Ultimately, leadership shapes the tone of an organization's ethical culture. When leaders prioritize integrity, transparency, and patient safety, those values become embedded throughout the entire healthcare system. Ethical decision-making is not something healthcare professionals simply absorb through experience. It is a skill that must be actively developed through education and training. Ethics education helps healthcare professionals learn to recognize ethical dilemmas when they occur. And that is actually one of the most important steps, recognizing that a situation even has ethical implications in the first place. Many ethical issues in healthcare are not obvious at first. They may involve competing responsibilities, uncertainty, or pressures from multiple sources. Once professionals recognize the dilemma, education helps them apply ethical reasoning. This involves evaluating the situation using ethical principles such as autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice, while also considering legal requirements and institutional policies. But ethical decision-making rarely happens in isolation. Healthcare professionals must also communicate effectively. Ethical discussions often involve conversations with colleagues, supervisors, and sometimes patients or families. Clear communication helps ensure that ethical concerns are addressed collaboratively rather than ignored. For laboratory professionals, ethics education may include topics such as accurate reporting, specimen integrity, quality assurance, confidentiality, and professional responsibility in diagnostic testing. Even though laboratory staff may not always interact directly with patients, the ethical consequences of laboratory work are enormous, because diagnostic decisions often depend on the accuracy and integrity of laboratory results. Healthcare organizations rely heavily on policies and procedures to guide consistent and ethical decision-making. Policies help ensure that healthcare professionals respond to situations in ways that are predictable, fair, and aligned with professional standards. Without policies, individual staff members might interpret situations very differently, which can create confusion, inconsistency, and sometimes serious ethical problems. Policies also serve an important protective role. They protect patients, because standardized procedures help ensure that care is delivered safely and consistently. but they also protect healthcare professionals because clear guidelines provide direction when difficult situations arise. In laboratory medicine, policies are everywhere, and for good reason. Think about specimen handling procedures, quality control protocols, result verification processes, critical value reporting policies, and infection control procedures. All of these policies exist to ensure that laboratory testing is accurate, reliable, and safe. Policies also help reduce the risk of ethical dilemmas by establishing expectations ahead of time. When clear procedures exist, laboratory professionals are less likely to face uncertainty about how to handle situations such as specimen mislabeling, questionable results, or communication of urgent findings. In short, well-designed policies provide structure that supports both ethical practice and patient safety. One of the most challenging realities in healthcare is that resources are not unlimited. Healthcare systems must constantly make decisions about how resources are allocated, including staff time, equipment availability, hospital beds, medications, and diagnostic testing. These decisions introduce ethical considerations involving fairness and justice. Healthcare organizations must determine how to distribute limited resources in ways that are both effective and equitable. For example, during times of high demand, such as public health emergencies or hospital capacity shortages, healthcare providers may need to prioritize certain patients or services based on urgency or clinical need. These decisions can be extremely difficult because they often involve balancing individual patient needs with broader population health considerations. In laboratory medicine, resource allocation might involve decisions about test prioritization, instrument availability, staffing during high workload periods, or determining when specialized testing should be performed. For example, laboratories often prioritize STAT testing, critical care diagnostics, or tests that influence immediate treatment decisions. Balancing these demands requires both clinical judgment and ethical reasoning. The key principle in these situations is justice, ensuring that decisions are made fairly, consistently, and transparently. Healthcare professionals must continually work to balance efficiency, patient needs, and ethical responsibility while maintaining the highest standards of care. This slide marks the transition into the final section of the chapter, where we bring everything we've discussed so far and apply it directly to laboratory professionals. Throughout this lecture, we've talked about ethical principles, organizational culture, compliance programs, leadership responsibilities, and healthcare policy. At first glance, many of these topics may seem focused on physicians, nurses, administrators, or hospital leadership. But ethical practice in healthcare is not limited to bedside decision-making. Laboratory professionals play a critical role in the healthcare system, even though we often work behind the scenes. In fact, laboratory results influence a significant percentage of clinical decisions, including diagnoses, treatment plans, medication adjustments, and patient monitoring. That means the ethical responsibilities we've discussed throughout this lecture absolutely apply to laboratory practice. Every specimen processed, every slide prepared, every quality control result evaluated, and every report verified carries ethical implications. When laboratory professionals maintain accuracy, integrity, and professional accountability, they contribute directly to patient safety. So in this final section, we're going to look at how the ethical principles we've been discussing translate into real-world laboratory practice. One of the most common misconceptions about laboratory medicine is that laboratory professionals are somewhat removed from patient care. After all, most laboratory staff do not interact directly with patients on a daily basis. But that does not reduce the ethical responsibilities of laboratory professionals. If anything, it highlights how important they are. Even though laboratory professionals may not be at the bedside, the information they produce has a direct impact on patient care decisions. Physicians and other healthcare providers rely on laboratory results to determine diagnoses, select treatments, and evaluate patient progress. If laboratory results are inaccurate, delayed, or misinterpreted, the consequences can affect real patients. This means that ethical laboratory practice includes maintaining strict attention to detail, accurate documentation, and adherence to established protocols. It also means recognizing when something seems wrong. For example, if a result appears inconsistent with previous testing, or if a specimen appears compromised, laboratory professionals have an ethical responsibility to investigate rather than simply releasing questionable data. Ethical laboratory practice is ultimately about protecting patients through scientific integrity. And while patients may never see the laboratory professionals who contribute to their care, the quality of laboratory work plays a crucial role in the outcomes they experience. Ethical challenges in the laboratory can arise in several different ways, many of which involve everyday professional decisions. One example is inaccurate test results. This might occur due to instrument malfunction, improper specimen handling, contamination, or procedural errors. Ethical practice requires that laboratory professionals identify potential errors and take appropriate corrective actions rather than ignoring or minimizing the issue. Another challenge involves delayed reporting. Timely reporting of laboratory results is essential for effective patient care. Delays may occur due to workload, instrument issues, or communication breakdowns. Ethical laboratory practice requires professionals to prioritize critical results and communicate urgent findings appropriately. A third concern is pressure to alter documentation. Occasionally, healthcare professionals may face pressure to adjust records, modify results, or overlook discrepancies. Ethical laboratory professionals must resist such pressures and maintain accurate documentation. Integrity in laboratory records is essential for both patient safety and legal accountability. Finally, laboratory professionals must protect patient confidentiality. Laboratory results contain sensitive medical information, and maintaining privacy is a fundamental ethical and legal responsibility. Together, these examples demonstrate how ethical principles translate into everyday laboratory decisions. This final slide brings everything together by emphasizing the connection between laboratory ethics and patient safety. Accurate laboratory results are essential for many aspects of healthcare decision-making. First, laboratory data play a central role in diagnosis. Many diseases are identified or confirmed through laboratory testing, including infections, metabolic disorders, hematologic conditions, and many forms of cancer. Second, laboratory results guide treatment decisions. Physicians use laboratory data to determine appropriate medications, monitor therapeutic responses, and adjust treatment plans as patient conditions change. Finally, laboratory results influence patient outcomes. Accurate and timely laboratory information allows healthcare providers to make informed decisions that improve patient care. Conversely, errors in laboratory testing can lead to misdiagnosis, delayed treatment, or inappropriate therapies. This is why ethical laboratory practice is inseparable from patient safety. Every step of the laboratory testing process, from specimen collection and preparation to analysis and reporting, must be performed with precision, honesty, and professional accountability. In many ways, laboratory professionals act as guardians of diagnostic integrity. Patients may never meet the people working behind the microscope or analyzer, but the accuracy and reliability of laboratory work can profoundly influence their health and well-being. This slide introduces one of the most fundamental concepts in healthcare ethics, professional integrity. Professional integrity refers to the expectation that healthcare professionals consistently act according to ethical principles and professional standards, even when no one is watching. In healthcare settings, integrity is built on three essential elements: honesty, transparency, and accountability. Honesty means accurately representing information, whether that involves documenting laboratory results, reporting errors, or communicating findings to other healthcare professionals. Transparency involves openness and communication. When something goes wrong, transparency requires acknowledging the issue rather than hiding or minimizing it. And accountability means accepting responsibility for professional actions and their consequences. Importantly, professional integrity is not only about doing the right thing when everything goes smoothly. It becomes most visible when mistakes occur. Healthcare professionals are human, and errors can happen in any complex healthcare system. What defines ethical professionalism is how those errors are handled. Ethical practice requires recognizing mistakes, reporting them appropriately, and participating in corrective actions that help prevent future harm. In laboratory medicine, this might include identifying instrument issues, investigating unexpected results, or reporting specimen problems. Maintaining professional integrity protects patients, strengthens healthcare teams, and preserves trust in the healthcare system. Healthcare systems depend heavily on public trust. Patients trust that healthcare professionals will act in their best interest, maintain confidentiality, and make decisions based on sound, ethical, and professional standards. This trust extends beyond physicians and nurses. It includes every member of the healthcare team, including laboratory professionals. Most patients will never meet the laboratory professionals who analyze their specimens or verify their test results. Yet those patients still trust that their laboratory testing is performed accurately, carefully, and ethically. Public trust in healthcare is built over time through consistent professional behavior. When healthcare professionals maintain high ethical standards, they reinforce that trust. However, when ethical standards are violated, whether through falsified documentation, negligence, or dishonesty, public confidence in healthcare institutions can be damaged. For this reason, professional ethics are not simply personal values. They are foundational to the functioning of healthcare systems. Ethical behavior ensures that patients, families, and healthcare providers can rely on the information and care being delivered. In laboratory medicine, maintaining professional trust means ensuring that every result released reflects accurate scientific practice and responsible professional judgment. This section serves as a bridge between the material we've been discussing in this lecture and the content that will appear on Exam 1. By this point in the course, you've explored several important areas of healthcare ethics. The goal of the exam is not simply to test memorization, but to evaluate how well you understand and apply these concepts. Exam questions may ask you to recognize ethical principles, interpret healthcare scenarios, or determine which ethical frameworks best apply in complex situations. You may encounter questions that require you to distinguish between ethical theories, evaluate professional responsibilities, or consider how healthcare teams approach difficult decisions. Some questions will focus on definitions and foundational concepts, while others will require more analytical thinking. The goal is to assess your ability to recognize how ethical reasoning functions within healthcare environments. As you prepare for the exam, focus on understanding the relationships between ethical theories, ethical principles, and real-world healthcare practice. Developing that ability to connect theory to practice is an important part of professional development in healthcare fields. This slide highlights several of the major themes that have been introduced throughout the first 4 weeks of the course. One of the first topics you encountered was ethical theories. These include frameworks such as utilitarianism, deontology, and virtual ethics, which help guide ethical reasoning and decision-making. You also explored the core ethical principles used throughout healthcare: autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice. These principles form the foundation of many ethical decisions in clinical and healthcare environments. Another important topic involves end-of-life dilemmas, which require careful consideration of patient autonomy, medical judgment, and ethical responsibility when decisions involve life-sustaining treatment. You also examined the role of ethics committees in healthcare organizations. These committees help healthcare teams evaluate complex ethical cases and provide guidance when difficult decisions arise. Finally, we discussed organizational accountability, including how healthcare institutions develop policies, compliance programs, and ethical oversight systems that promote responsible practice. Together, these concepts form the ethical foundation that healthcare professionals rely on when navigating complex situations. Understanding these principles will not only help you succeed on exam 1, but will also prepare you to evaluate ethical challenges that arise throughout healthcare practice. This slide shifts us into a reflective moment, the kind of questions healthcare professionals should pause and consider when navigating ethical situations. Ethical decision-making in healthcare rarely involves simple yes or no answers. Instead, it often involves evaluating complex situations where different responsibilities, values, and patient interests intersect. The first question here asks, who is responsible for ethical decision-making? The short answer is everyone involved in healthcare. Ethical responsibility does not belong only to physicians, administrators, or ethics committees. Every professional, including laboratory professionals, shares responsibility for maintaining ethical standards within their scope of practice. The second question asks, how do institutions support ethical behavior? Healthcare organizations create structures designed to support ethical practice. These include policies, compliance programs, ethics committees, reporting systems, and professional standards. These structures help guide decision-making when situations become complicated. The third question is particularly important. What happens when ethical principles conflict? And this is where real ethical reasoning begins. In healthcare, principles such as autonomy, beneficence, and justice do not always align perfectly. Sometimes honoring one principle may limit another. For example, respecting patient autonomy may conflict with what healthcare providers believe is medically beneficial. Understanding how to evaluate and balance these competing considerations is a key skill for healthcare professionals, including those working in the laboratory. When healthcare professionals encounter ethical complex situations, it helps to approach the problem systematically rather than reacting emotionally or impulsively. This slide introduces a simple set of questions that help guide ethical reasoning. The first question is, what are the facts? Before making ethical judgments, it is essential to clearly understand the situation. In healthcare, assumptions can be dangerous. Accurate information about the patient, medical condition, laboratory findings, and clinical context must come first. The second question asks, which ethical principles are involved? This is where we apply the foundational principles we've discussed throughout the course: autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice. Identifying which principles apply helps clarify the ethical dimensions of the situation. Next, we ask, who is affected by this decision? Ethical decisions in healthcare often affect multiple stakeholders. This may include patients, families, healthcare providers, and sometimes even the broader healthcare system. Finally, we ask, what decision best supports patient welfare? In healthcare ethics, protecting patient well-being remains the central priority. While policies and institutional guidelines matter, the ultimate goal is ensuring safe, responsible, and compassionate patient care. For laboratory professionals, ethical reasoning might involve decisions about reporting questionable results, handling specimen problems, or ensuring accurate documentation when unexpected findings occur. This slide provides a structured framework that healthcare professionals can use when approaching ethical problems. Rather than relying on intuition alone, ethical frameworks help ensure that decisions are thoughtful, systematic, and professionally justified. The first step is to identify the ethical issue. Sometimes the ethical issue is obvious, but in other cases it may be less visible. Recognizing that an ethical concern exists is the first step towards addressing it. The second step is to gather relevant information. In healthcare environments, decisions must be informed by accurate data, clinical context, institutional policies, and professional guidelines. In laboratory settings, this might include reviewing specimen integrity, instrument performance, or test validation data. The third step is to consider the ethical principles involved. This is where healthcare professionals evaluate how principles such as autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice apply to the situation. Next comes evaluating possible actions. Often there is more than one potential response to an ethical dilemma. Each option should be evaluated based on its potential consequences and alignment with ethical principles. Finally, professionals must make and justify a decision. Ethical decision-making requires not only choosing a course of action, but also being able to explain and defend the reasoning behind that decision. In professional practice, accountability is an essential part of ethical behavior. This slide summarizes several key themes from the chapter and helps tie together the broader discussion of healthcare ethics. The first takeaway is that ethics committees support complex decision-making. Healthcare ethics committees serve as interdisciplinary groups that help evaluate difficult cases and provide guidance when healthcare professionals face challenging ethical situations. Their role is not to replace clinical judgment, but to provide perspective, structure, and ethical analysis. The second point highlights that ethical responsibility is shared across healthcare organizations. Ethical healthcare practice is not the responsibility of any single individual or profession. Instead, it requires collaboration among healthcare providers, administrators, policymakers, and institutional leadership. Every professional contributes to the ethical culture of a healthcare organization. The final takeaway reminds us that institutional policies guide professional conduct. Policies and procedures exist to help healthcare professionals navigate complex situations in consistent and responsible ways. These guidelines support accountability, protect patients, and promote ethical standards across healthcare systems. For laboratory professionals, these policies influence areas such as documentation practices, quality control procedures, confidentiality standards, and reporting responsibilities. Ultimately, ethical healthcare practice emerges from the combination of individual professional integrity and organizational support systems working together. One of the most important realities of healthcare ethics is that ethical practice is rarely the responsibility of a single individual. Instead, ethical decision-making in healthcare is collaborative. Complex healthcare situations often require input from multiple perspectives. Physicians bring clinical expertise, nurses bring insight into patient care and day-to-day clinical realities, administrators help interpret institutional policies and regulatory requirements. Patients and their families also play an essential role because healthcare decisions ultimately affect their lives, values, and preferences. Laboratory professionals are part of this collaborative system as well, even though our role sometimes happens behind the scenes. For example, laboratory results may influence decisions about diagnosis, treatment options, or prognosis. A pathology interpretation, a critical lab value, or a specialized test result can significantly affect how patient care providers proceed with patient care. Because of this, laboratory professionals contribute to ethical decision-making by ensuring that the scientific information guiding those decisions is accurate and reliable. Collaboration also means communication. Healthcare teams function best when professionals share information openly, respect each other's expertise, and work towards the common goal to safe, ethical patient care. Ethical healthcare practice is strongest when the entire team participates in maintaining those standards. This slide helps connect the material we've been discussing to Exam 1, which will assess your understanding of the key ethical concepts introduced during the first 4 weeks of the course. When preparing for the exam, focus first on the core ethical principles we've discussed: autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice. You should be able to recognize these principles, understand what they mean, and identify how they apply in healthcare situations. Next, review the major ethical dilemmas discussed in the readings. Rather than simply memorizing examples, try to understand why these situations are ethically complex. Ask yourself which ethical principles are in tension and how healthcare professionals might reason through the situation. Another important area involves understanding the role of ethics committees. Ethics committees provide guidance in complex cases, help healthcare teams analyze ethical issues, and offer structured perspectives when difficult decisions arise. Finally, review the concept of institutional accountability. Healthcare organizations are responsible for creating policies, compliance systems, and professional standards that promote ethical behavior. Exam questions may ask you to recognize how these systems support ethical healthcare practice. As always, the goal of the exam is not simply memorization, but your ability to apply ethical reasoning to real healthcare situations. We'll end this lecture with a reminder that ethical healthcare practice operates on two important levels. First, there is individual professional integrity. Every healthcare professional, whether working at the bedside, in a laboratory, or in an administrative role, carries a personal responsibility to act honestly, responsibly, and in the best interest of patients. Professional integrity shapes daily decisions, how carefully we perform our work, how transparently we communicate problems, and how accountable we are for our actions. The second level involves institutional responsibility. Healthcare organizations must provide the structures that support ethical practice. This includes policies, ethics committees, professional standards, compliance programs, and a culture that encourages accountability and transparency. When both of these levels work together, individual integrity and institutional support, healthcare professionals are better equipped to navigate the complex situations that arise in real clinical environments. For laboratory professionals, this means recognizing that every specimen processed, every slide prepared, and every result reported contributes to the ethical foundation of patient care. Even though patients may never meet the professionals working in a laboratory, the integrity of that work plays a critical role in the decisions that affect their health. And that is ultimately what ethical healthcare practice is about, ensuring that every part of the healthcare system works together to support safe, responsible, and patient-centered care. Thanks.